He's online. Okay, do we see him?
Yes, Vint Cerf is there.
Oh, wow, that's cool. We hear your voice, but can't really see you. So let's see. Yeah, there you are. Wow.
How about that? Amazing when these things work.
Yeah, it works. I'm see. You see, just maybe I stand on the other side here, so I can. Yeah, I shall look at. Where should I look? Here, there. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you very much, Vint Cerf, for being with us. It's the ISOC-SE here, the Swedish ISOC chapter, and the Swedish network Your Society have our autumn conference. So you are our keynote speaker. So I will actually hand over to you immediately. And thank you so much for being
Well,
online.
well, before we do this, I'm noticing a certain amount of bandwidth problem. Uh, your audio was breaking up a bit, and I don't know how good my audio and video are. What do you think? It's okay? All right. In the worst case, I'm running on a Wi-Fi, and it occurs to me that switching to hard Ethernet cable might make a difference. But let's try for now. Goddag, jag talar inte svenska. It's very embarrassing because my wife used to be Sigrid Torstenberg, and of Swedish descent. She moved to Wichita, Kansas, or in the neighborhood anyway, somewhere in the mid to late 1800s, probably around 1860 or 1870. So I eat Swedish really well. I just don't speak it very well. So I see Patrick is already up in the distance there. You're a little out of focus, Patrick, but maybe that's normal. Or maybe it's me. Uh, anyway, question for you. I have a number of things that I'd like to bring up for the attention of this group, some of which is related to messages that you and I have exchanged recently concerning governments and others to regulate the internet at its various layers. Is it suitable for me to rattle on for a little while on those topics, or do you have a more preferred Q&A for this discussion?
No, we have 30 minutes, and I think if you talk for like 15 or something, 15, 20, 15 minutes, and then we can have questions. We have talked about manners, we talked a
Okay.
little bit about fake news, we talked about internet access, the quality of internet access, a little bit of openness of the internet. So talking about how we're going to control this might actually or take a step back. So how do we move forward together, and something like that is perfect.
So it's a very interesting and very difficult question. I don't know to what extent you have discussed the outcome of the IGF or the Plenipot meetings, to say in Dubai, and to say nothing of the various organizations that have been popping up concerning cybersecurity. For example, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, or the high-level panel that the UN set up that I participate in, among others. It's very clear that there is a lot of concern about the way in which internet and the World Wide Web are being used in our societies. There's also some concern, continuing concern about access to the internet, about costs, about barriers. You think we have to aggregate a lot of that together and come to some conclusions about how to avoid bad outcomes while at the same time coping with the fact that the internet is being abused by a number of people who do not mean us well. Uh, I recently was in Oxford and gave what's called the Romani's lecture on November 6th. And the title of that lecture was The Pacification of Cyberspace. And I deliberately used that term rather than internet or World Wide Web because the real issue here is abuse of all forms of computing, whether they're online or not. We depend increasingly on software devices driven by software. The most dramatic example of that, of course, is the avalanche of the Internet of Things. And everyone in the room, I suspect, knows about the ways in which IoT devices have already been abused the webcams that were used to attack Dine Corporation, for example, had virtually no security at all. As technologists, I think we have not only a responsibility, but we have a problem insofar as the safety and security of the things that we make and that we offer to other people. We have a responsibility to improve their resistance to abuse. And I think that we are being expected of us to do something about that. At the same time, we're also seeing governments, for example, or regulatory agencies saying that there are bad things happening on the internet and we have to stop that. And then they look anywhere they can to any organizations that have responsibility and demand that they fix these problems. And as you pointed out more than once, Patrick, in many cases, the demands are being made of the wrong organizations and at the wrong level in the architecture of the system. One wants to apply the remedies at the right layer in the architecture. And one of the areas where this has become a serious problem, I think, is in what's called intermediary services. For example, the network providers are not responsible, shouldn't be responsible for the content that shows up on the transmission lines. They shouldn't be responsible at the IP layer for blocking. And yet, what's happening is that it's easy, even in conceptual sense, to apply some of these remedies at those layers, to block at the IP layer, to block at the DNS layer, or more complicated, to block at the search layer, if I can call it a layer, the search service. And you end up with things like the right to be forgotten, or other kinds of blocking that shows up in the search engines, which doesn't make a great deal of technical sense. I mean, for example, in the case of right to be forgotten, you have to remember everything you're supposed to forget, because you have to remember in order to block it. And that list gets longer and longer over time, and you never know when you can take anything off the list because it might come back again. So there's something that's not very satisfactory from the technical point of view about some of the demands that are being made. I'm sure you've had discussions about the global GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, which has had substantial extraterritorial impact. The recent thing about this is that if every sovereign country decides to make up its own data protection rules and demand that everyone in the world apply them, you're going to end up with an impossible task, or you're going to wind up with a highly fragmented internet service, because in every country in the world, there'll be some set of limitations that some external authority has tried to enforce on your local operators. So I think that as technologists, we have to recognize that we don't work them, but we have to find ways to be helpful at the same time as trying to find ways to make this work better and to preserve some of the important properties that we've experienced in the internet in the past, they primarily being openness, freedom of exchange of information, and freedom of access to information. I remember when Esther Dyson once said that the remedy for bad information was not censorship, but more information. Unfortunately, we're not seeing governments agreeing with that position, or instead turning around and saying, let us deny information to people that we think is harmful. So we get this demand to remove accounts that are infusing Facebook or Twitter with content that somebody thinks is unfair or inappropriate. And even if it's true that the information is deliberately intended to misinform, to mislead, to persuade people to positions that perhaps are not in their best interest, one would wish that people would think critically about what they're seeing and hearing and discard the information which is of little value. The problem we have with that is that it takes a lot of work to think critically about content, to ask questions like, where did this content come from? Is there any corroborating evidence that this information should be accepted and taken on board? Is there an obvious or maybe not so obvious intent to mislead, and for what purpose? So all those questions have to be asked if you're going to think critically about content, and not everyone is prepared to take the effort to do that. I have a kind of a syllogism for responding to abusive behaviors in the internet, and that syllogism is like this. If you can inhibit the harmful behavior technically, sometimes that's very attractive because then you avoid the problem entirely by preventing that problem from happening. When it comes to denial of service attacks, when it comes to malware attacks, things of that sort, these technical mechanisms make sense to me. To interfering with content, I'm less comfortable with technical measures because I'm not persuaded that they work very well. In particular, using artificial intelligence to decide whether something should be filtered makes me a little worried, partly because AI is not always functional, doesn't always work, or it's brittle, but more important, that's a censorship function, and censorship is something which doesn't sit well for somebody who grew up in a First Amendment right, freedom of speech environment. But anyway, technical mechanisms to inhibit harmful behaviors, I think, are a reasonable response. And not surprisingly, we're being asked to consider that. When it comes to safety and security, for example, two-factor authentication is another good example of the technical response to a serious problem. And I'm a big fan of that. And of course, at Google, we strongly urge people to use two-factor authentication to protect their accounts. Cryptography is a way of protecting a certain amount of information, and we are eager to apply that in our services. For example, access to most of our applications in the cloud are using cryptographic means to protect the flow of data, and we similarly encrypt all the data that we hold in our systems while it's at rest. So that's the technical response to some of these problems. The second thing that we can do is what I would call post hoc enforcement. All it means is that if you catch somebody doing something that we all agree is inappropriate, or we might even agree is illegal, then we will say, if we catch you, there will be consequences. And that's what law enforcement is all about. And once again, that's not an unreasonable response. You can't expect to catch everybody. You can't expect to inhibit bad behaviors, absolutely. But you can certainly warn people that if we catch them, there will be consequences. And we are seeing exactly that response for a number of abusive behaviors on the net. Then there's the third possibility, and that's moral suasion, which sounds wimpy. You know, just don't do that. It's wrong. You know, it's just wrong. And that sounds like it wouldn't be very effective. But I remind you that this is a little bit like gravity. Gravity is the weakest force in the universe. And yet, when you get a large enough mass, it's pretty powerful. For example, the sun keeps the Earth in orbit because of its gravity. So if you have a norm in society that's been adopted that inhibits bad behavior, then that actually can be quite powerful. Peer pressure, social pressure, can certainly be effective. I will point out, however, that we have worked examples where you need a combination of these mechanisms in order to deal with the bad behavior. For example, in the case of smoking, for years we tried to tell people that smoking was dangerous, that it would cause cancer, that you could die from smoking. And a lot of people just ignored that. Still, laws were passed that said packages of cigarettes have to say, if you smoke, you'll die. It's also true, of course, if you don't smoke, you'll die too. But the point is, maybe you'll die earlier if you smoke. The second thing is that we said, by the way, if you smoke in this building, there will be consequences. So we said you can't smoke in certain places. We put laws in order to provide incentives to adopt behaviors that we consider to be societally acceptable or preferable. The same is true for seatbelts, by the way, even though it's pretty evident that if you don't wear a seatbelt and you get in an accident, you could be pretty badly hurt. Interestingly enough, for many years, people knew this and were shown, videos of terrible accidents that had grievous injuries or even death because you weren't wearing a seatbelt. But only after laws were passed that said, if you make a car in the United States, you can't sell it if it doesn't have seatbelts. Or we said, if we catch you driving without your seatbelt, there will be consequences. So we mixed together social incentives and advice along with law enforcement. So that suggests to me that these three mechanisms, the technical prevention, post hoc enforcement, and moral suasion, may have to be the tools we use to cope with the abusive behaviors on the internet. And just how those should be formulated and whether they can be formulated in a way that is multilateral or global remains to be seen. Cultures adopt different views of the abusive behavior, and what's abusive in one culture might not be in another, or might be tolerated in another. Certainly, if you look at the United States, you see that freedom of speech is so important that we tolerate some kinds of speech that nobody likes. On the other hand, we're also seeing some severe reactions to what is alleged to be Russian intervention using social networking tools in our elections, and perhaps you've seen this in other countries as well. And we're seeing very strong reprisals demanded of the social networking companies, even though in some respects they're intermediaries because they're not the ones that create the content that shows. So at this stage of the game, I think we are all, as we sit in rooms like the one you're in, asking how do we recover a lot of the freedom that the internet delivered to us, while at the same time protecting people's rights and safety. I don't have very many magic answers to this. I do think that we have a responsibility as a technical community to try to think our way through this and respond with methods that will allow users to protect themselves, allow companies to carry out their or provide their services in a way that protects the company from undue political or legal interference. But we have to find a way to solve the problem, and it's obvious that there's no single solution, nor is there in this spectrum, there's not necessarily an agreement on a global basis as to where we draw a line and say, at this point, the behavior is so abusive that we have to step in and do something. Whereas the other side of the line, you might say we should tolerate it because if we don't, then other freedoms will go away. So I'm extremely interested to find out what your thinking is about this, particularly given that you live in a country that has long, in my view anyway, long been a bastion of freedom of expression. So, Patrick, I'll turn this back to you and ask what kind of debate and discussion we might pursue at this point.
To start with, I would like to just give you two examples of what we talked about this morning when talking about disinformation, which was what we sort of talked about instead of using the term fake news. Of course, we used the term fake news first to just trigger discussion, which worked quite effectively. And we had, for example, Olof Ehrenkrona, that you might know from the Swedish Foreign Ministry, now retired from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And he said very clearly that, first of all, disinformation is something that we always have had. Since Martin Luther, he was very fond of disinformation about his enemies, for example. So from his perspective, it was really important. He said that we have so many signs from history that decreasing the amount of communication and exchanging information is not a successful path forward to fight disinformation. Then we had a professor from the University of Stockholm talking about similar thing, and he said that one of the problems that we can attack and that we might forget is the business case itself behind the machinery that deals with disinformation, because there is a quite high interest of just increasing the amount of information that is passed around. And of course, he was pointed at ad-driven financial mechanisms that, as the clickbait thing phenomena, has nothing to do with polarization or nothing to do with what information you are passing around. There was just an economical incentive to just generate and pass around information. That was a business case itself that we should not forget. And then, given those two sort of major trends, we have, from my perspective, what you just have pointed out, a cooperation between the other forces and mechanisms we have, where of course norms and corporate social responsibility and norms in the society, that is something that we should work with, which of course also points towards the differences between cultures, which of course always by itself will create stress, right?
So just to respond immediately, let me say that these problems are not solved on a country-by-country basis. I think that particularly the serious harms that are occurring in the online world have to be dealt with in a cooperative way, which is why the Secretary General's high-level panel is called the Panel on Digital Cooperation. The problem, as everyone in this room knows, is that the perpetrator of harm may be in one jurisdiction and the victim is in another, often in a different country. So we have that problem to deal with. The other problem we have to deal with is the computing in order to amplify some of these attacks, and that botnets are becoming a very popular tool for launching denial of service attacks or generating spam or producing misinformation and disinformation. And the problem we have is that we can't always tell the difference between a bot and a human being. And so we misunderstand, for example, the data that flows through the system because it appears that there is a strong, let's say, agreement about a particular piece of information because the bots make it look as if lots of people agree with it. So we have a kind of a Turing test 2 problem in this situation where our software can't tell the difference between a human who is engaged and a computer program that's engaged. It's sort of a variation on the Turing test that was made famous back in the 1930s when Alan Turing proposed that a human try to figure out the difference between a computer and a person by just exchanging text messages with them. Our own computing resources have become our enemies because they are giving asymmetric power to people who intend to do harm.
Any questions from anyone else in the room?
Take the chance now when you have anything in mind.
Anyone?
Well, I want to know what you guys are going to do about this problem. You can't just sit there. I'm sorry, but
Okay.
you have as much responsibility as I do.
Oh, you already have a microphone. So, Leif. Well, what we have been looking during the day, we have had, apart from what I just described, we of course have had a more technical discussion as well, to try to see how we can sort of make the whole environment in Sweden better. We talk about encouraging ISPs and IXs to sign up to the manners, just to do routing security more secure. We talk about coming up with the definition of internet access, which will make it easier for buyers and sellers of high-quality internet access, open internet access, to meet and negotiate on real terms to get the access they really sort of deserve and what they really want. So what we have been talking about during the day is quite a lot from we started with this disinformation thing, but then we have been talking about, like, basically how do we make sure that the sort of the water we get out of the Ethernet outlets is as clean as possible. So it has, from a technical perspective, has to do with that sort of cooperation and collaboration which is talked about. We have not talked about legislation and such things, and law enforcement, which is something that we talked more about a year ago, like at the conference we had last year. Not so much this year, but that is of course something that is needed.
So just to jump in on a technical note, one of the reasons that we have a lot of these problems is that our software is vulnerable. We make software that has bugs in it. Those bugs get exploited by the bad guys. And so one technical question is whether we can do a better job of creating software environments that inform us of the mistakes that we're making or inhibit us from making those mistakes. So software programming environments may turn out to be an important research focus. For years, there have been attempts to figure out how to determine whether a program has bugs in it. We've not done very well over the past 80 years during which programming has been a discipline. It's embarrassing that we haven't made better progress, but it does seem to me that that's one technical area where we could contribute. There have been a number of programming systems that are trying to find bugs in software, but the biggest problem we have is that they have a high false alarm rate. And at some point, you get tired of coping with the system saying, there's a bug here, and it turns out that there isn't. So I think that's one area where I still believe research is useful. And I can, you know Steve Crocker, of course, and Steve is also very interested in that problem. Because that's what he did his dissertation work on many years ago, and that his interest has been reignited, as has mine. So that's one place where we might be able to make some progress.
Well, another thing that we mentioned, just for your information, has to do with artificial intelligence. We had Staffan Tre from Recorded Future, and he showed the state machine how Bitcoin wallets, together with IP addresses, AES numbers, spam, and the sources for various different kind of information that they're gathering. They are trying to predict whether an IP address will be used for malware in the future. And he showed an example where they were able to predict that an IP address was going to be used 10 days before a specific attack was sourced from that IP address. So maybe that kind of thing, and a discussion we had was whether that kind of predictability and deep learning and just looking at various different kind of sources can be used for prediction of where you might get bad data from in the future. So he claims that if they're lucky, they are 10 days ahead of actual attacks.
I'm terrified by claims along those lines. And the reason,
of course,
I think of the minority as one example. And things that we know that these AI systems are very brittle, and they make mistakes, but we don't necessarily know or can't anticipate the mistakes they'll make. The generative adversarial networks, that generate very, very realistic images in order to fool another artificial intelligence into believing it's a real picture, is an example of that. And we got to the point with those various experiments where changing just a few pixels of an image dog causes the recognition system to think it's a fire truck. And I worry about mistakes like that, especially if we didn't have the ability to predict them. So it's an interesting idea, but I would be very cautious about relying on those kinds of tools.
No, Staffan brought that up. We have a question from the audience here. I just want to tell you that he sees an increased ability to predict, because when the business case is built around and when the bad guys are doing this in a more automated fashion, it also ends up being more predictable. So that was actually what, at the moment, was something that actually helped him to do this prediction, because the more automated it is, the more predictable it is. But anyways, we have a question from the audience here, please. Is the microphone on? There's no, I don't hear an audience. Try again. Huh?
Hello.
Oh, good.
Better? Okay. Hi. It's a pleasure seeing you and hearing you, and thank you for being with us. What about the claims of major commercial actors taking over the internet? What possible harm can they do? What possible benefits can they give us? And what should anything be done about that? And if so, what?
So Tim Berners-Lee has been making noises along those lines. I don't feel as if these companies have taken over the internet, but they certainly are a major part of the products and services that people use. So I understand that. I will say that Google, for example, has grown partly because the economics of large-scale cloud computing is very attractive. Trying to redistribute the net, I think, is a hard problem because I don't think the economics and the other incentives for maintaining a distributed system are particularly attractive. For example, if somebody said, well, why don't we just have store our information in other people's computers? Let's make this a fully distributed system. Are the parties who are holding our information going to maintain their computing resources? Will they upgrade them at need? If computer fails, will they, will they back things up for us? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm nervous that ordinary users will not likely have the incentive that a company like Google or Facebook or Amazon or what have you have to maintain the hardware, upgrade the hardware, maintain service quality and everything else. So I think that this notion of trying to redistribute the web is probably unlikely. It will be unlikely to succeed. However, I would point out that anyone who looks at these large companies and says, well, they're too dominant and they should be broken up, one question is, what do you break them up into? And that isn't too clear to me. And the second one is that they don't always last forever. I mean, we remember MySpace, and we remember something called Tri-Cities or Digital Cities or something like that, who was at the peak of its operation many years ago, and now it was acquired by Verizon, for example. Look at the computing companies that have disappeared. Look at Digital Equipment Corporation has gone away. IBM has completely transformed itself. My view right now is that these large-scale service providers are large-scale in part because there is demand for their services, and in part because there is an economy of scale that's available. If, on the other hand, becomes apparent that those services are being abused in ways that either the general public or the legislators conclude is unacceptable, there will be regulation, the existence of that. So I don't think that scale is necessarily bad, but I do believe that use of these tools in abusive ways is cause regulation of one kind or another, made more complicated by the fact that the internet platform is global in scope and is relatively ignorant of national boundaries, creating a fairly complex challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Does the microphone work here? Yeah, okay, thank you. This is Maria here. I'm the chair of the ISOC Swedish chapter here, and it's very good to have you here, Vint. And we talked about in the earlier sessions, for instance, about in the fake news session we talked to, or the disinformation session, we talked about not only the consumer power, the power of the consumer, but also the consumer responsibility. And I think actually when it comes to the Internet Access Project that Patrik talked about, I think when the consumer get to know what they can buy, they can compare to different products, and they can also demand more things for the products or the software they buy. I think that's a power that we have to see more about. I think because that's really powerful. If you could know what you can demand and you know what you have to claim from the software and from the access, you get the broadband or whatever you call it, the internet access. But I think we need to see more of that actually, and because now we are a little bit naive when we use these different softwares and so on, and that's a little bit in connectivity, in connection with what you said, what Inga said before, the question of who is taking over the internet. So the power of the consumer, I would like to see it more. So I want to hear your comment of that.
Well, I do think that there is great power in being able to walk away from a product or service. If you say, I will buy your product unless certain conditions apply, that can be a pretty persuasive argument. Let me suggest one other thing, which is a little scary from my point of view, and that is the notion of liability. If you look at all the various invasions of products and services that have revealed personal information that is later used or abused to create false identities or to get access to people's accounts. Companies that have suffered those breaches are often not penalized very much, except perhaps in the marketplace, but not legally. I do wonder whether liability will be yet another incentive for companies to work harder to protect the safety and security of their users. But remember, users need to have choice. Otherwise, the threat to move to another service does work very well if there is no other place to go. And that's why you end up often with regulation if there isn't adequate competition.
So
I apologize, but I now all that I need to jump on, so we'll have to finish this one. But I really appreciate your patience allowing me to jump in at the end of the day and to just rattle on for a while.
Yeah. So we also have a present for you. As a thank you very much, we will send this in email to you. We have donated money in your name, which we do with all speakers. Instead of giving presents, we donate money to an organization that it's basically Doctors Without Frontiers. So we donated some money for you in your name, and we send you the PDF so you can print it yourself.
That's very sweet of you. I do appreciate that very much. And please let me encourage you to tackle these problems. Need to solve them.
Yeah.
Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very much.